If indeed a single sin which had been laid on him had been left unexpiated, he must have remained forever in the grave. Death would in that case have detained him as its prisoner, for the wages of sin is death. By his incarnation, Jesus Christ received in his human nature the fullness of his Spirit, but he received it covered with the veil of his flesh. By his death he merited the Spirit to sanctify his people, but still this was only a right which he had acquired without its execution. By his resurrection he entered into the full exercise of this right. He received the full dispensation of the Spirit to communicate it to them, and it was then he was declared to be the Son of God with power. Verse 5, by whom we have received grace and apostleship for obedience to the faith among all nations, for his name. One of the first acts of the power of Jesus Christ after his resurrection was to bestow his Spirit and his grace on those who were chosen by him, to qualify them to be his witnesses and the heralds of his gospel. Paul was among that number, although appointed at a later period than the rest. We have received. He here speaks of himself in the plural number. He does not appear to use this style that he may include the other apostles. What is true of him will, however, as to everything essential, apply to all the others. He distinguishes these two things, grace and apostleship. The first, which he had experienced in his conversion, and in every subsequent part of his course, he had received from Jesus Christ, and by him also he was appointed to the office of an apostle, to the discharge of which that grace was indispensably necessary. 2. The obedience of faith. Paul, as an apostle, was commissioned to preach the gospel in order to the obedience of faith. Some understand this of the obedience which faith produces, but the usual import of the expression, as well as the connection in this place, determines it to apply to the belief of the gospel. Obedience is no doubt an effect produced by that belief, but the office of an apostle was, in the first place, to persuade men to believe the gospel. This is the grand object which includes the other. The gospel reforms those who believe it, but it would be presenting an imperfect view of the subject to say that it was given to reform the world. It was given that men might believe and be saved. The obedience, then, here referred to, signifies submission to the doctrine of the gospel. This is quite in accordance with those passages in which the expression is elsewhere found, as in Acts 6:7, Romans 7:17, Romans 16:26, Galatians 3:1, 2 Thessalonians 1:8, 1 Peter 1:22, and in Romans 10:3, where the Israelites are charged with not submitting to the righteousness of God. And especially in the 16th verse of that chapter it is said, "But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Esaias saith, Lord, who hath believed our report?" This is his commandment that we should believe on the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, 1 John 3:23. The object, then, of faith is not only a promise, but a promise accompanied with a command to accept it. For since it is God who promises, his majesty and authority accompany his promise. In respect to the promise, that which on our part corresponds to it is called faith, but in regard to the commandment which enjoins us to receive the promise, the act on our part is obedience. On this account, unbelief is the rebellion against God. Faith, on the other hand, is the act of submission, or the surrender of ourselves to God, contrary to the natural opposition of our minds, in order that he may possess and conduct us and make us whatever he pleases.